The steel-gray skies of an Iowa winter had given way to the piercing blue of spring when the first train carrying German prisoners of war rolled into the small farming community of Algona in April 1944. The local townsfolk gathered at a distance, some curious, others wary, as hundreds of men in worn Feldgrau uniforms disembarked under the watchful eyes of American guards. These were not the defeated, broken men many Americans had expected. Instead, they stood tall, shoulders back, chins lifted in defiance. Many wore the confident smirk of men who, despite their capture, still believed in the ultimate victory of the Third Reich. As one prisoner, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Peschel, would later write in his secret diary, "They think they have conquered us by bringing us to this farmland wilderness, but they do not understand that the German spirit cannot be imprisoned by mere fences." Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The Americans had a different perspective. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell, the camp commander who would oversee this unprecedented experiment, watched the new arrivals with a practiced eye. A career military man with a background in agriculture, Lobdell had been handpicked for this assignment. His mission: transform these soldiers, many of whom were battle-hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps and the Eastern Front, into productive agricultural workers who would help save America's threatened harvest during the labor shortage of World War II. As he would later tell the Des Moines Register, "They laughed when we told them they'd be working in the fields. By August, they weren't laughing anymore." This forgotten chapter of American history represents one of the most unusual domestic programs of World War II, the housing of approximately 372,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. Among these, nearly 10,000 found themselves in Iowa, a state chosen for its distance from the coasts, its agricultural importance, and its need for labor. What unfolded there between 1944 and 1946 was not merely a story of captivity, but a complex human drama that would challenge preconceptions on both sides and leave an indelible mark on the Iowa landscape and its people. The story of these German POWs in America's heartland is emblematic of a larger, often overlooked aspect of World War II, the way in which enemy combatants were treated when brought to American soil, and how this treatment reflected American values even in the midst of a global conflict. The United States, bound by the Geneva Convention of 1929, provided housing, medical care, and adequate food to its prisoners. Yet beyond these obligations lay the greater challenge: what to do with thousands of able-bodied men who represented an ideology that America was fighting to defeat. By the time the first German POWs arrived in Iowa, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The tide had begun to turn against Nazi Germany after the Allied invasion of Italy in 1943. But the D-Day landings at Normandy were still months away. The Germans who arrived at Camp Algona and its satellite facilities across Iowa were primarily soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy, men who had served under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and who had until recently expected to be on the winning side of the conflict. The main camp at Algona was built to house 3,000 POWs and covered 287 acres of Iowa farmland. Surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, it contained barracks, a hospital, mess halls, recreation facilities, and administrative buildings. From this central facility, the Army established 34 smaller branch camps throughout Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, placing prisoners where their labor was most needed, primarily on farms and in food processing plants. For many Iowans, the arrival of these prisoners brought the war home in unexpected ways. Clarence Steffen, a farmer from near Hampton, Iowa, recalled his surprise at the appearance of the POWs assigned to help with his corn harvest. "I expected them to look different somehow, monstrous maybe, from all the propaganda. But they were just young men, like our own boys overseas, except they spoke German and had a different outlook on everything. That different outlook would be the source of both tension and eventual transformation. Many of the prisoners, particularly those who had been indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, arrived with a profound sense of cultural and racial superiority. They had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, and lacking in discipline. The rural farmland of Iowa, with its simple lifestyle and agricultural focus, seemed to confirm their preconceptions about American backwardness. Wolfgang Müller, a 23-year-old POW who had served in Rommel's panzer divisions, wrote in a letter, later confiscated by camp censors, "The Americans have placed us in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless fields and simple farmers. They think this will break our spirit, but it only confirms what the Führer told us about their lack of culture and sophistication." Such attitudes were common among the early arrivals, particularly those who had been captured before Germany's military fortunes had clearly turned. Many remained convinced that Germany would win the war and that their stay in America would be temporary. This belief fueled resistance to the idea of working for the American war effort, even in non-military capacities like agriculture. Camp authorities understood that mandatory work assignments were not only permitted under the Geneva Convention, but were essential to maintaining discipline and preventing the psychological deterioration that often accompanies idle captivity. Article 27 of the Convention specifically allowed captors to employ prisoners of war, provided the work was not directly related to military operations, was not dangerous or degrading, and prisoners were paid for their labor. Lieutenant Colonel Lobdell implemented a system that would both fulfill America's obligations under international law and serve the practical needs of the war effort. Prisoners would work primarily in agriculture, replacing the American farm workers who had either been drafted or had left for higher-paying defense industry jobs. They would receive 80 cents per day in scrip that could be used at the camp canteen to purchase personal items, tobacco, and additional food. The first work assignments in the spring of 1944 were met with resistance from many prisoners. Some cited their status as non-commissioned officers, which under the Geneva Convention exempted them from work requirements. Others simply refused, accepting punishments like reduced rations or confinement, rather than assist what they still viewed as the enemy. Hans Grunberg, a staff sergeant captured at the Battle of Monte Cassino, led one of the first work stoppages. "We are soldiers of the Reich, not farmhands," he reportedly told camp authorities. "The work is beneath our dignity as German officers." This statement revealed both a misunderstanding of their actual status under international law and the deeply ingrained class and military hierarchies that many prisoners brought with them from Germany. Camp records indicate that this resistance began to crumble when faced with the realities of Iowa's summer climate. Prisoners who had fought in the deserts of North Africa found themselves unprepared for the humid heat of an Iowa July, when temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees Celsius, with humidity levels to match. The prisoners who agreed to field work returned with painful sunburns, blistered hands, and a new respect for the physical demands of farming. "After 1 week in the cornfields, I understand why Americans are so obsessed with taking showers," wrote Friedrich Weber in a letter home that was later published in a collection of POW correspondence. "The heat and dirt get into everything. The work is harder than any military training I experienced." For Iowa's farmers, the presence of German POWs as workers produced complex reactions. Many were initially hesitant to allow the enemy onto their property, particularly those with sons fighting overseas. Elmer Johnson, whose farm near Storm Lake employed 8 prisoners during the summer of 1944, expressed a common sentiment. "At first, I didn't want them anywhere near my land. My boy was fighting in Italy, maybe against some of these very men. But then I realized my crops would rot in the fields without help, and that wouldn't do anybody any good, least of all our boys overseas who needed the food." The Department of Agriculture and the War Food Administration worked diligently to overcome such hesitations, emphasizing both the economic necessity of the program and the strict security measures in place. Farmers were assured that prisoners would be accompanied by armed guards and would return to camp each evening. As labor shortages grew more acute, pragmatism generally overcame reluctance. What neither the military authorities nor the farmers had fully anticipated was the degree of cultural exchange that would inevitably occur once Germans and Iowans began working side by side in the fields. Despite language barriers and initial suspicion, daily proximity fostered a grudging respect and, in some cases, genuine human connections. Martha Ritter, who was 16 when prisoners came to work on her family's farm near Clarion, recalled in a 1995 oral history interview, "My father was strict about us not fraternizing with the Germans, but you can't work alongside people day after day without some kind of relationship forming. By harvest time, we knew all their names and a little about their families back in Germany. They weren't Nazis to us anymore. They were Karl and Heinrich and Wilhelm, young men a long way from home." Such humanizing interactions were not universally welcomed. Government officials worried about coddling the enemy, and some community members viewed friendly relations with POWs as borderline treasonous. The War Department issued regular reminders to farmers about maintaining appropriate distance and avoiding discussions of military matters or American politics with prisoners. Yet the reality on the ground often defied such regulations. Iowa farm families, known for their hospitality, frequently provided homemade lunches to the prisoners working their fields, technically a violation of rules that stipulated POWs should eat only Army-provided rations. Some farmers with German heritage or German language skills engaged prisoners in conversations about their hometowns or pre-war lives, discovering shared cultural references or even distant family connections. These small acts of humanity did not go unnoticed by the prisoners. Karl-Heinz Richter, who worked on farms near Eldora, wrote after the war, "We came to America expecting to find enemies. In those Iowa fields, working beside those quiet, hard-working people, I discovered that humanity transcends national boundaries. It was a lesson I carried back to Germany and have kept all my life." The evolution of attitudes among the prisoners was neither universal nor uniform. Camp Algona, like most POW facilities in America, contained a cross-section of German society in uniform. There were committed Nazis who maintained their ideological fervor throughout their captivity. There were career military men who had served the German state without necessarily embracing Nazi racial theories. And there were draftees who had never wanted to fight in the first place and were secretly relieved to be out of the war. This diversity created complex social dynamics within the camp itself. The U.S. Army, recognizing the potential for conflict, generally separated known Nazi Party members and ardent Hitler supporters from the general prisoner population. However, intimidation and internal policing among prisoners remained a challenge throughout the system. Johann Schmidt, a prisoner who had been a schoolteacher in civilian life and was known for his moderate views, described the situation in a post-war memoir. "Even in Iowa, thousands of miles from Germany, we were not free from the party's eyes and ears. Those who spoke against Hitler or expressed doubt about Germany's victory might wake to find a small swastika drawn on their bunk, a warning to watch their words." American intelligence officers monitored these internal dynamics, identifying prisoners who might be open to re-education about democratic values or who might provide useful information about German military operations. This aspect of the POW program balanced humanitarian treatment with strategic objectives, recognizing that today's prisoners would be tomorrow's citizens in a post-war world that America hoped to shape. By late summer of 1944, the initial resistance to farm work had largely faded. Practical necessity, the alleviation of boredom, and the earning of canteen money proved persuasive to all but the most ideologically committed prisoners. Camp records show that by August, More than 90% of eligible POWs at Algona and its branch camps were participating in work programs, the vast majority in agricultural roles. The impact of this labor on Iowa's wartime economy was substantial. During the 1944-45 growing seasons, German POWs helped harvest approximately 35% of Iowa's corn crop and a significant portion of its other agricultural products. They worked in canneries, processing vegetables, in meat-packing plants, and in forestry operations. The War Department estimated that POW labor in Iowa alone saved millions of dollars and thousands of tons of food that might otherwise have been lost to labor shortages. For the prisoners, the work provided structure, purpose, and a way to pass time that might otherwise have hung heavy. It also offered glimpses of American life that contradicted much of what they had been told by Nazi propaganda. They saw prosperous family farms with mechanical equipment that many German farmers could only dream of owning. They observed democratic processes in action at local town meetings and county fairs. They experienced religious freedom as local churches offered German-language services for those prisoners who wished to attend. These observations had particular impact on younger prisoners who had grown up under the Nazi regime and had never known any other political system. 18-year-old Heinz Schroeder, who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht just months before his capture, wrote in his diary, "In Germany, we were told that American capitalism meant most people lived in poverty while a few were rich. But these farmers all have automobiles, radio sets, and equipment for their fields. The ordinary workers live better than many professionals do at home. It makes me question what else we were told that wasn't true." Not all cultural exchanges were positive. In some communities, particularly those with casualties in the European theater, hostility toward the German prisoners remained high, regardless of their behavior or work ethic. There were isolated incidents of violence, though these were remarkably rare given the circumstances. Camp authorities worked diligently to prevent clashes by carefully selecting work sites and maintaining adequate security. The prisoners themselves developed varying perspectives on their American experience. Some remained resentful of their captivity and resistant to any positive impressions of American society. Others embraced the opportunity to learn about a different way of life and began to reassess their previously held beliefs. Many occupied a middle ground, appreciating the humane treatment they received while remaining loyal to their homeland, if not necessarily to its current regime. Werner Klein, a prisoner with artistic talents who would later create the famous nativity scene that still stands in Algona today, captured this ambivalence in a sketch that showed a German soldier standing at the camp fence, looking out at Iowa farmland, with an expression that blended longing, curiosity, and resignation. Beneath it he wrote in German, "Captive in body, but the mind wanders free." As 1944 progressed into autumn, news from Europe increasingly reached the camps through approved newspapers and radio broadcasts. The Allied landings at Normandy, the liberation of Paris, and the steady push toward Germany's borders could not be hidden from the prisoners. These developments forced many to confront the likelihood that Germany would lose the war, and that the world they would eventually return to would be dramatically different from the one they had left. This realization affected different prisoners in different ways. Some hardcore Nazis retreated further into denial and ideology. Others began to consider how they might position themselves for the post-war period, showing sudden interest in American democratic institutions or distancing themselves from their previous political affiliations. Most simply tried to process what defeat would mean for their homeland and families. Camp administrators observed these psychological shifts with interest. The War Department had begun developing a more formal re-education program for German POWs, recognizing that these men would play a role in post-war Germany. At Algona, this took the form of carefully curated reading materials, educational films, and voluntary classes in English and American history. Captain Walter Schutz, who oversaw educational programs at Camp Algona, noted in a report to his superiors, "We are seeing a gradual but perceptible shift in attitudes among many prisoners. Their exposure to American life, combined with news from the front, is creating an opportunity to plant seeds of democratic thinking that may bear fruit when these men return to Germany." By late 1944, the daily routine at Camp Algona and its satellite facilities had settled into a predictable pattern. Prisoners rose at 5:30 a.m. for roll call, followed by breakfast in the mess hall. Work details departed at 7 a.m., returning to camp by 6 p.m. Evenings were devoted to recreational activities, educational programs, or simply socializing in the barracks. Lights out came at 10 p.m. Within this structured environment, prisoners created a microcosm of German society. They formed musical groups, putting on concerts of classical music and traditional German folk songs. They established sports leagues with soccer matches, drawing hundreds of spectators from among the prisoner population. They created a camp newspaper, Der Drahtpost, the Wire Mail, which featured news, creative writing, and artwork by prisoners. These activities served multiple purposes. For the prisoners, they provided a sense of normalcy and connection to their cultural identity. For camp administrators, they offered constructive outlets for energy and potential means of influence. The American authorities generally supported such initiatives as long as they didn't promote Nazi ideology or present security concerns. Religious services became another important aspect of camp life. Although the Nazi regime had complicated relationships with organized religion, many German soldiers maintained their faith. Protestant and Catholic services were offered regularly at Camp Algona, conducted by military chaplains or, when possible, by ordained ministers among the prisoner population. These services provided spiritual comfort and another venue for reflection on values that often stood in contrast to Nazi teachings. As winter approached, the agricultural work that had occupied most prisoners naturally diminished. Camp authorities scrambled to find alternative assignments that would keep prisoners productive during Iowa's harsh winter months. Some were trained for indoor work at meat processing facilities or manufacturing plants producing non-military goods. Others were assigned to snow removal, building maintenance, or forestry work cutting timber for fuel. The winter of 1944-45 proved particularly challenging. Temperatures in Iowa plunged to record lows, and snow accumulated to depths that made transportation between camps difficult. Prisoners who had complained about the summer heat now experienced the opposite extreme, with temperatures regularly falling below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front were no strangers to severe winter conditions, but even they found the persistent cold of the Iowa winter testing. Josef Meyer, who had survived the brutal Russian winter during the Wehrmacht's retreat from Moscow, wrote with a touch of irony, "In Russia, we at least were moving, fighting, which kept the blood flowing. Here, working in the lumber camps, the cold seeps into your bones and stays there until spring." The isolation imposed by winter weather affected morale among both prisoners and their American guards. Cut off from regular movement between camps and with outdoor recreation limited, tensions occasionally flared. Camp records note an increase in disciplinary incidents during January and February 1945, though most were minor infractions rather than serious security concerns. It was during this winter that news of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front, reached the camps. The initial German success, followed by ultimate defeat, further crystallized the reality of Germany's situation for many prisoners. Letters from home, heavily censored but still revealing between the lines, began to speak of bombing raids, food shortages, and the approaching Allied armies. For prisoners with families in the path of the Soviet advance from the East, these months brought particular anxiety. The reputation of the Red Army for harsh treatment of German civilians, fueled by years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front, was well known. Many prisoners expressed a hope that their hometowns would be captured by American or British forces rather than Soviet ones. Erich Kurtz, whose family lived in Dresden, wrote repeatedly to camp authorities requesting information after hearing rumors of massive bombing raids on the city. When confirmation of Dresden's destruction in February 1945 finally reached him, he was devastated. "My city, my beautiful Dresden, is gone," he told his American supervisor at the lumber camp, "and I sit here in safety while my mother and sisters may be dead." Such human moments continued to complicate the relationship between captors and captives. American guards and work supervisors who had initially viewed the prisoners as faceless enemies increasingly saw them as individuals with their own fears, hopes, and losses. This did not erase the reality of what German forces had done in Europe, or the fact that American soldiers were still dying at German hands, but it added layers of complexity to the daily interactions at the camps. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, dramatic developments in Europe accelerated. The Allied forces crossed the Rhine into Germany proper. Russian troops approached Berlin from the east. Reports of concentration camps liberated by American and British forces began to emerge, revealing horrors that shocked the world and raised new questions about collective German responsibility. When news of Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, reached Camp Algona, reactions among the prisoners varied dramatically. Some openly celebrated, revealing anti-Nazi sentiments they had previously kept hidden. Others mourned, still loyal to the man and ideology that had led Germany to catastrophe. Many simply absorbed the news in silence, processing the definitive end of a regime that had dominated their lives. Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8th brought the European war to a close, but created new uncertainties for the prisoners. They were now captives from a defeated nation with an unclear future. When would they be sent home? What would they find when they got there? How would they be received by occupation authorities? These questions hung heavy in the camps as the summer of 1945 began. For Iowa's farmers, the continuation of the POW labor program remained essential despite the war's end. The 1945 growing season still faced severe labor shortages, as American servicemen had not yet been demobilized in large numbers. German prisoners would once again provide critical support for planting, cultivating, and eventually harvesting the state's important food crops. The summer of 1945 brought subtle but significant changes to the prisoner work program. With Germany's surrender, the security concerns surrounding POWs diminished. Guard details were reduced and prisoners gained somewhat more freedom of movement during work assignments. Some farmers now allowed prisoners to eat with the family rather than separately, a small but meaningful change in status. The most significant shift, however, was in the prisoners themselves. With their country's defeat now undeniable and the Nazi regime destroyed, many experienced a psychological liberation that allowed them to engage more openly with American society and ideas. The rigid ideological positions that some had maintained crumbled in the face of new realities. Attendance at voluntary English classes and discussions of democratic governance increased dramatically after Germany's surrender. Camp records show that by July 1945, more than 60% of prisoners at Algona were participating in some form of educational program, compared to less than 20% a year earlier. Many were actively preparing for life in a different kind of Germany than the one they had left. As the harvest season approached, a new question emerged. With the war over, how long would the prisoners remain on American soil? The logistical challenges of repatriating hundreds of thousands of POWs were immense, particularly given the devastated condition of Europe's transportation infrastructure. Additionally, German POWs were now viewed as a potential resource for reconstruction efforts in Europe, with American, British, French, and Soviet authorities all making claims on their labor. The uncertainty created anxiety among many prisoners who now simply wanted to return home and discover the fate of their families. Hans Weber expressed a common sentiment in a letter to his American work supervisor. "We appreciate the good treatment we have received here, but now our thoughts are only of home." Each day here, while our families may be suffering, becomes harder to bear. For Iowa's communities, the prospect of the prisoners' departure created practical concerns about completing the harvest, but also prompted reflection on the unusual social experiment that had unfolded in their midst. Relationships had formed, perspectives had shifted, and the clear lines between us and them had blurred in many unexpected ways. As the corn ripened in Iowa's fields that August, the prisoners who had once laughed at American farm work now moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, their bodies tanned and toughened by months of outdoor labor. The transformation from arrogant military men to capable agricultural workers was complete. But the deeper transformations, the ones that had occurred in hearts and minds on both sides of the barbed wire, would prove to have the more lasting impact. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the farmland surrounding Camp Algona as the harvest of 1945 reached its conclusion. For many German prisoners, this would be their last American season. Repatriation plans were taking shape, though the process would stretch well into 1946. As they gathered the last of Iowa's corn crop, many contemplated the strange journey that had brought them from the battlefields of Europe and Africa to these peaceful Midwestern fields, and the even stranger journey that awaited them as they returned to a homeland transformed by defeat and occupation. The end of harvest brought a moment of reckoning as prisoners and locals acknowledged the impending conclusion of their unusual relationship. In farm kitchens and camp recreation halls across Iowa, conversations took place that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. Germans who had arrived as the enemy were now departing as something more complex, not quite friends perhaps, but fellow humans with whom a significant experience had been shared. In December 1945, as the first groups of prisoners prepared to depart, Camp Algona became the site of an unexpected cultural contribution that would long outlast the POW program itself. A group of prisoners with artistic skills, led by Eduard Kaib and Horst Wendland, approached camp authorities with a proposal to create a nativity scene as a parting gift to the community. Working with scrap lumber, plaster, and whatever materials they could salvage, they crafted 60 half-life-sized figures depicting the traditional Christmas story. The nativity scene was unveiled at a special ceremony attended by prisoners, guards, and local townspeople. Captain Lobdell, in one of his final acts as camp commander, accepted the gift on behalf of the community. "This beautiful work of art," he said, "will serve as a reminder that even in the midst of global conflict, the human capacity for creativity and goodwill remains undiminished." The Algona nativity scene, as it came to be known, would become the most tangible and enduring legacy of the POW camp. Displayed annually for decades after the war, it attracted visitors from across the Midwest and served as a physical reminder of the complex human story that had unfolded in this small Iowa town. For many former prisoners who later returned to visit, it represented a concrete symbol of reconciliation. As 1946 progressed, the repatriation of German POWs accelerated. The process was complicated by new geopolitical realities, particularly the division of Germany into occupation zones controlled by different Allied powers. Prisoners from regions now under Soviet control often expressed reluctance to return, fearing harsh treatment or forced labor. American authorities, while sympathetic, were bound by international agreements to repatriate all prisoners to their country of origin. The departure process involved careful screening and documentation. Prisoners received health examinations, new clothing for the journey, and a small amount of money. They were also issued certificates documenting their work experience in America, papers that would prove valuable in securing employment in post-war Germany. Before leaving Camp Algona, many prisoners took time to write letters of thanks to the farmers and community members with whom they had worked. These farewell notes often revealed the profound impact their Iowa experience had made on their worldview. Otto Günther, who had worked for 2 summers on the Jensen family farm near Mason City, wrote, "When I came here, I knew America only as an enemy. I leave knowing it as a nation of individuals, many of whom showed me kindness I did not expect. This knowledge is perhaps the most valuable thing I take home with me." For Iowa's farmers, the departure of the POWs created mixed emotions. The practical challenge of finding replacement labor remained paramount, particularly as many returning American servicemen showed little interest in resuming farm work. Yet, beyond these concerns, many farmers and community members felt a surprising sense of loss as the prisoners departed. Martha Brandt, whose family employed POWs on their farm near Clarion, later recalled, "It sounds strange to say we missed the German boys when they left, but we did. They had become part of our rhythm, part of our community, in a way. The field seemed emptier without them, and not just because we needed the help." By the spring of 1946, only a small contingent of prisoners remained at Camp Algona, mostly those awaiting transportation, or with special skills needed for the camp's decommissioning. On September 1, 1946, the facility officially closed, bringing an end to a chapter of Iowa history that had begun just 2.5 years earlier, but had left an indelible mark on all involved. The physical structures of Camp Algona were quickly repurposed or dismantled. Barracks were sold to local farmers who converted them into machine sheds or storage buildings. The hospital became a community medical facility. Guard towers and fencing were removed, and much of the land returned to agricultural use. Within a few years, little visible evidence remained of the camp that had housed thousands of German prisoners. For the former prisoners returning to Germany, the challenges were immense. They arrived in a country physically devastated by bombing and ground combat. Many found their hometowns unrecognizable, family members dead or displaced, and economic opportunities severely limited. The Germany they had left no longer existed, replaced by an occupied nation struggling to come to terms with defeat and the horrors committed in its name. In this difficult environment, many former POWs found that their American experience provided unexpected advantages. Those who had learned English or acquired new skills during captivity often secured positions with occupation authorities or in industries being rebuilt with American assistance. The agricultural knowledge gained in Iowa proved valuable as Germany worked to address critical food shortages. Perhaps most significantly, prisoners who had been exposed to American democratic practices and values often became advocates for similar systems in the new Germany. They had seen firsthand an alternative to the authoritarian models that had dominated German political life, and many embraced the opportunity to help build a different kind of society. Karl Becker, who had spent 18 months at a branch camp near Eldora, returned to his hometown in what would become West Germany, and eventually was elected mayor. In a 1975 interview with an American researcher, he credited his POW experience with shaping his political outlook. In Iowa, I saw how local government could serve the people rather than dominate them. I saw citizens speak freely at town meetings, criticizing officials without fear. These were revelations to me, and they became the foundation of my approach to governance. Not all former prisoners integrated their American experiences so positively. Those who returned to areas under Soviet control often found themselves under suspicion precisely because of their time in America. Some were sent to labor camps or prisons by Soviet authorities who viewed them as contaminated by Western influences. Others learned to hide their American connections, rarely speaking of their time in Iowa, even to family members. For most, the POW experience became one chapter in a life story dramatically shaped by the upheavals of the mid-20th century. They had lived through Nazi Germany's rise and fall, experienced combat and capture, spent months or years in the American heartland, and returned to help rebuild a shattered nation. Their perspectives were inevitably complex, layered with contradictory experiences and emotions that defied simple categorization. The impact of the POW program on Iowa's communities proved similarly nuanced. The immediate economic benefits were clear: crops harvested, food processed, timber cut, all contributing to both the war effort and local prosperity. Yet the cultural and psychological impacts, though less quantifiable, were perhaps more profound and lasting. Communities that had initially viewed the German prisoners with fear or hostility had been forced to reconsider their perceptions through daily interaction. The humanity of the enemy had become impossible to deny, complicating the simpler narratives of wartime propaganda. This did not erase awareness of Nazi atrocities or discount the sacrifices of American servicemen, but it added layers of understanding that many Iowans had not anticipated. Religious communities, particularly those with German heritage, often played important roles in this evolving relationship. Many Iowa towns had been settled by German immigrants in the 19th century, and some residents still spoke German or maintained cultural traditions. Local Lutheran and Catholic churches sometimes offered German-language services for prisoners, creating spaces where cultural connections could transcend the immediate context of war. Pastor Wilhelm Schmidt of St. John's Lutheran Church in Algona later reflected, "In ministering to the prisoners, we were reminded that God's family transcends national boundaries and political conflicts. The young men who attended our services were not faceless enemies, but souls in need of spiritual comfort, no different from our own sons serving overseas." The educational impact extended beyond the prisoners themselves. Iowa school children whose only previous knowledge of Germans came from newsreels and propaganda posters now saw actual Germans working in their communities. Teachers incorporated the presence of the POWs into lessons about world geography, language, and current events, creating experiential learning opportunities that textbooks could not provide. June Hamilton, who taught at Algona High School during this period, organized a carefully supervised cultural exchange in which German prisoners with educational backgrounds spoke to students about German geography and culture, deliberately avoiding political topics. "My goal," she later wrote, "was to help students understand that a nation is more than its current government or policies. It is people with a history, culture, and humanity that exists independent of the current conflict." As the decades passed, the story of German POWs in Iowa gradually faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by the more dramatic narratives of combat and Holocaust that dominate World War II history. The men who had once worked Iowa's fields returned to their lives in a divided Germany. The farmers who had employed them focused on the post-war agricultural boom. The physical evidence of the camps disappeared from the landscape. Yet the connections established during those war years occasionally resurfaced in unexpected ways. Former prisoners who had established genuine relationships with Iowa families sometimes maintained correspondence across the decades and the Atlantic. A few even returned to visit, particularly after travel restrictions eased in the 1960s and 1970s. Hans Mueller, who had worked on the Johnson farm near Clarion, made his first return visit in 1962. The local newspaper recorded the event. Former German POW revisits Iowa farm where he once worked. Miller, by then a successful engineer in West Germany, brought his wife and children to meet the family he had often told them about. "I wanted them to see this place that changed how I understand the world," he told the reporter, "and I wanted to thank these people properly, now as a free man rather than a prisoner." Such reunions, while relatively rare, provided opportunities for reflection on both sides. Iowans who had known the Germans only as prisoners now met them as middle-aged professionals, family-men, citizens of a new democratic Germany. Former prisoners who had experienced Iowa only through the restrictive lens of captivity now saw it as ordinary visitors, free to explore the communities that had once confined them. Werner Becker, who returned to visit the Schmidt family in 1967, was struck by how normal the landscape appeared without the barbed wire and guard towers that had framed his wartime experience. "I kept looking for landmarks I remembered," he wrote afterward, but everything seemed simultaneously familiar and strange. The fields where we worked so hard are just fields now, beautiful in their ordinariness, with no trace of our presence. For Iowa's agricultural communities, the POW program left a complex legacy. The immediate labor crisis had been resolved, allowing the state to maintain and even increase food production during critical war years. Techniques developed to efficiently deploy and manage prisoner labor contributed to post-war agricultural productivity. Some farmers even adopted European farming methods they had learned from their temporary workers, creating a small but meaningful transfer of agricultural knowledge. The social impact proved more difficult to measure, but no less significant. Communities that had initially viewed the arrival of the enemy with alarm had been forced to engage with the humanity behind the labels of war. This experience challenged the dehumanizing narratives common to all conflicts and created space for more nuanced understandings of responsibility, nationality, and individual choice within the context of global events. Dorothy Schweder, an Iowa historian who conducted extensive research on the POW camps in the 1980s, argued that the program represented a remarkable experiment in human relations during a time of intense international conflict. Her interviews with Iowans who had interacted with the prisoners consistently revealed how personal connections had complicated and often superseded abstract notions of enmity. The historian Arthur Smith, writing in the Iowa Journal of History in 1979, noted, "What occurred in these rural Iowa communities was a grassroots version of international relations, unfolding not in the diplomatic conference rooms of Washington or Berlin, but in cornfields and farm kitchens. Ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, school teachers found themselves engaging with the enemy, not as an abstraction, but as individuals with names, faces, and stories." Not all memories of the POW program were positive, of course. Some local communities, particularly those that had lost many sons to the European battlefield, maintained a distance from the German prisoners that never evolved into anything warmer. Some prisoners remained committed to Nazi ideology throughout their captivity and returned to Germany with their prejudices intact, or even reinforced by resentment over their detention. For Jewish residents of Iowa communities near the camps, the presence of German soldiers, some of whom may have participated in or been complicit with Nazi atrocities, created particularly complex emotions. Although Iowa's Jewish population was relatively small and concentrated in urban areas rather than the rural communities where most POWs worked, those interactions that did occur were inevitably shadowed by awareness of the Holocaust, news of which emerged with increasing clarity as the war concluded. Rabbi Simon Davidson of Mason City, whose congregation occasionally encountered German prisoners in town under guard, later recalled the complicated emotions these meetings evoked. To see men in German uniforms walking the streets of an American town, even as prisoners, it was disturbing for those of us who had family in Europe we couldn't account for. We knew what the Nazi regime had done. At the same time, we recognized that not every German soldier was personally responsible. As Jews, we are taught to see the humanity in each person, but this tested that principle severely. Such tensions were an inevitable part of the POW program's complex reality. Yet the predominant pattern, particularly in the agricultural settings where most prisoners worked, was one of gradually evolving relationships that moved from fear and suspicion toward grudging respect, and sometimes even friendship. This evolution reflected both human adaptability and the specific character of Iowa's rural communities, places where practical necessity often trumped ideology and where work well done earned respect regardless of who performed it. The end of Camp Algona and its satellite facilities in 1946 did not conclude the story of German POWs in America. Across the United States, similar camps were being decommissioned as prisoners returned to Germany. Altogether, approximately 372,000 German POWs had been held on American soil during and immediately after the war, constituting one of the largest prisoner of war operations in U.S. history. The American POW program had been remarkably successful by most measures. Escape attempts were rare and usually brief. Mistreatment of prisoners was minimal compared to the horrific conditions in many other What-To prisoner situations. The labor provided by the prisoners made a significant contribution to the American economy during a period of acute manpower shortage, and the exposure of hundreds of thousands of Germans to American society created a corps of individuals who would carry first-hand knowledge of democratic practices back to a nation being rebuilt after totalitarianism. This is not to suggest that the program was without flaws or controversies. Historians have documented instances of prisoner abuse, particularly in southern camps where racial attitudes sometimes led to German POWs receiving better treatment than African American soldiers serving in the U.S. military. Some critics argued that the program was too lenient, providing comforts to enemy soldiers, while Americans suffered rationing and combat deaths. Others questioned the ethics of having prisoners perform labor that contributed even indirectly to the war effort against their own country. Yet, when viewed in the context of how prisoners of war have been treated throughout history, and particularly against the backdrop of the horrific POW experiences common on the Eastern Front of World War II, the American program stands as a remarkable exercise in humane treatment of enemy combatants, even amid a total global war. For the prisoners who experienced it, the American captivity often became a formative life experience that influenced their post-war trajectories in significant ways. Many former POWs who had worked in agriculture sought opportunities to emigrate to the United States or Canada after repatriation, drawn by the farmland and opportunities they had glimpsed during captivity. While tight immigration restrictions initially prevented most from returning, by the 1950s, some had managed to make their way back to the country that had once held them prisoner. Otto Fisher, who had worked on farms near Storm Lake, returned to Iowa in 1957 and eventually purchased land, not far from where he had once worked as a prisoner. When interviewed by the Des Moines Register for a 30th anniversary retrospective on the POW program, he reflected, "People sometimes ask if it feels strange to live so close to where I was held prisoner. I tell them, no, I'm exactly where I want to be. I fell in love with this land when I was forced to work it. Now I work it by choice, and that makes all the difference." Fisher's story, though not typical, exemplifies the unpredictable ways in which the POW experience reverberated through individual lives long after the war had ended. For him, and others like him, the Iowa interlude became not merely a wartime detour, but a pivotal experience that redirected life's course. More commonly, former POWs incorporated their American experience into lives rebuilt in post-war Germany. Many maintained an interest in American culture and politics throughout their lives. Some became advocates for stronger German-American relations during the Cold War period, arguing from personal experience that American society offered a positive alternative to Soviet communism. Friedrich Kellner, who had been a prisoner at a branch camp near Muscatine and later became a municipal official in West Germany, wrote in his 1978 memoir, "My captivity in Iowa showed me an America very different from Nazi propaganda. I saw a society that, while imperfect, valued individual freedom and opportunity. This vision helped guide my work in local government, where I tried to implement the democratic practices I had observed in America." For Iowa's communities, the POW episode gradually transformed from current events to living memory to history. By the 1980s, when serious academic study of the camps began in earnest, many of the Iowans who had directly interacted with the prisoners were elderly or deceased. Their recollections, when recorded by researchers, often focused on the humanity that emerged through daily interaction rather than the politics that had created the conflict. Elmer Gustafson, who employed prisoners on his farm near Fort Dodge, told an oral historian in 1987, "They were just young fellows like our own boys. Same hopes, same complaints, same jokes sometimes. Working together, you couldn't help but see that. I'm not saying we forgot they were German or that some of them still believed in Hitler, but you saw the person behind all that. That's what I remember most, that they were people first, enemies second. This theme, the recognition of common humanity across the divisions of war, emerges consistently in accounts from both former prisoners and their Iowa hosts. It speaks to a fundamental reality of the POW program that transcended its economic and military rationales, the creation of spaces where enemies engaged as individuals, where abstract hatreds collided with concrete human encounters, and where the complexity of identity could not be contained by the simplistic categories of wartime thinking. The historical significance of this aspect of the POW story has only grown with time. In an era when wars are increasingly fought through technology that distances combatants from one another, the face-to-face encounters of Iowans and Germans in the 1940s offer important insights into how conflict and reconciliation function at the human level. The evolution from fear to familiarity, from propaganda-fueled hatred to reluctant respect, reveals patterns of human interaction that remain relevant to modern conflicts and their aftermath. By the early 21st century, most direct participants in the POW program had passed away. The German soldiers who arrived in Iowa as young men in their 20s would now be in their hundreds if still alive. The farmers who employed them, the guards who watched them, the community members who gradually accepted their presence, these too have largely departed the scene. What remains are artifacts, documents, oral histories, and the subtle ways in which this episode influenced both American and German society during the crucial post-war decades. In Algona, the most tangible reminder is the nativity scene created by Eduard Kaib and his fellow prisoners. Displayed annually at the Kossuth County Fairgrounds, it continues to draw visitors who often know little about the camp that produced it. A small museum housed in the former POW-built chapel preserves photographs, documents, and artifacts from Camp Algona, maintaining this history for future generations. Elsewhere in Iowa, physical evidence of the POW camps has largely disappeared. Former branch campsites are now farms, industrial areas, or housing developments with little to indicate their wartime role. Occasionally, local historical societies maintain small exhibits or markers commemorating these forgotten places. But most Iowans today have little awareness of the German prisoners who once lived and worked among their grandparents and great-grandparents. Yet the legacy of the POW program lives on in less visible ways. It lives in the family stories passed down about the German boys who helped bring in the harvest during the war years. It lives in the agricultural techniques that some prisoners introduced to Iowa's farms. It lives in the international perspectives that the experience brought to rural communities previously isolated from global affairs. And it lives in the complex understanding that emerged from this encounter, the recognition that humanity persists even in the context of history's most destructive conflicts. The story of German POWs in Iowa reminds us that war, for all its horror and division, cannot entirely suppress the human capacity for connection. In the midst of global conflict, on the rich farmland of America's heartland, enemies became laborers, laborers became acquaintances, and some acquaintances became friends. Simple distinctions blurred as daily interaction revealed the inadequacy of wartime categories to contain the fullness of human identity. This was not a story of perfect reconciliation or uncomplicated friendship. The shadow of Nazism, the reality of battlefield deaths, the atrocities committed in Germany's name, these could not and should not be erased by pleasant interactions in Iowa's cornfields. Many prisoners remained committed to aspects of the ideology that had led their nation to catastrophe. Many Iowans maintained a justified wariness toward men who had fought for a regime antithetical to American values. Yet, within these constraints, genuine human connections formed that transcended the boundaries of nationality and conflict. The German prisoners who arrived in Iowa, convinced of American inferiority, encountered instead a society that challenged their preconceptions and often treated them with unexpected humanity. The Iowans, who initially viewed the prisoners as faceless enemies, discovered individuals with their own stories, skills, and complexities. Perhaps the most eloquent summation of this unlikely wartime encounter comes from a letter written by former prisoner Wilhelm Schroeder to the Johnson family of Clarion in 1988, more than 40 years after he had worked on their farm. "In the worst of times, you showed me the best of humanity. Working your land taught me that the soil knows no nationality. Growing food that nourishes people speaks a universal language. This understanding has been the harvest of my life, planted during those Iowa summers so long ago." The German soldiers, who once laughed at the idea of farm work, only to have Iowa's relentless summer sun burn away their arrogance, left a subtle but enduring mark on the communities that temporarily housed them. Their story stands as a testament to the resilience of human connection even in war's divisive shadow, and to the transformative potential of encounters that allow us to see the individual behind the uniform, the person beyond the politics, the shared humanity that persists despite history's darkest chapters.